Very last question, because as I said, we've kept you for a while, but it just follows from a point that you've just made about the Russians um, essentially having sovereignty, and with sovereignty comes agency. Do you think that might mean going forward that the Russians might find it easier in terms of East-West relations with the West to deal with the Americans than the with the Europeans, in the sense that the Americans, because they're absolutely a sovereign power, that they have more agency than the Europeans appear to do? I mean, you had very hard work over many decades building up a relationship with Germany, for example, and it flipped around almost immediately, partly because the Americans were so opposed to it. And the Germans didn't have full agency, and they had all kinds of issues, internal issues, which flowed, by the way, to a great extent from that, the enormous influence in Germany of the United States. Do you think that people in Moscow may say, well, if we're going to talk to the West, let's talk to the Americans, because they can actually make decisions. They have that level of freedom of action that no European government today has? Just the question.
Uh, I don't know what will happen to Europe in years to come. Uh, I think we should disregard the current hysteria around Trump because it's rather, what is the word, the moral hazard, the panic. Of course, Trump will not destroy transatlantic ties. Trump will not withdraw from NATO and so on. So the first presidency of Trump was not good for Europeans, but it was no disaster. More than that, actually, what he demanded, they started to do. I mean, pay more for the membership, and that was not only him who said it to Europeans. But of course, whoever will follow Trump, the profound question about whether Americans will need Europe as much in the future as they did in the past is obvious, because world is changing, exactly what we discussed moments ago. The problem, actually, it's normal. It's nothing new. The problem is that the Europeans and the German politicians and people in particular, whom you mentioned, they believed in the end of history most of all. They really believed that history has ended, and things which happened to Europe in 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, will never return. I can understand them, because Europe committed a suicide, actually, in the 20th century, and the period of successful European integration, first Western European, then all European, that was like a fairy tale. And it's so difficult to acknowledge that this fairy tale has ended. But the question is what to do next. And, in Russia, years ago, and even maybe 20 years ago, at the point when Putin deeply believed that it was a way to find a place for Russia in the European-centric world, around Iraq war, when Putin supported Schroeder and Chirac in their opposition against George W. Bush. And actually, people don't remember that, but Putin was not very enthusiastic about this. He didn't want to do it, actually. He never supported, of course, Iraq war, but he believed that at that point, okay, let Americans do stupid things they want to do, but our relationship with Americans is more important, so let. And that the European leaders, Chirac and Schroeder, convinced him that no, we need to come together and to resist and so on. And he decided to do it, I think, for practical reason, because he expected Europe to reevaluate possible models for a relationship with Russia after this. And at that time, we had a lot of intellectual discussions here that now we see that Americans are going global and militant, and so Europeans don't need it. So now it's time for Europe, and we will support that, to understand, to realize their strategic interests. And the strategic interest of Europe is, of course, to get together with Russia, Russian resources, European technologies, money, people, and so on. Nothing like this happened, because after Putin supported France and Germany against Bush, and then he, so to say, asked, okay, what next? Let us work together and cooperate. They said, yes, of course, great, thank you very much. Now please go to Brussels and start negotiations about some new treaty. And, this is European integration. We cannot do much. This is not our prerogatives and so on. And, of course, it didn't work. But why I say it? Because at that time, it was a strong belief in Russia among some important people that Europeans will evolve into much less America-centric, centered, dependent, to much more strategically autonomous group or nations and so on. I think since that, everything which happened since that, not only during Ukrainian conflict, but even before, demonstrated that it was not realistic at all to expect such development. Europe doesn't know what to do in case Americans will decide to abandon them. Or at least, okay, not to abandon, but at least to decrease involvement, as Trump probably will do. Because during the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War, at periods which were absolutely awful and nasty, like the beginning of 80s, when Ronald Reagan came to power in Washington and introduced immediately sanctions against German, Italian, French, British companies who participated in this gas project to extend the gas deliveries to Western Europe. Chancellor Brandt, President Mitterrand, who was Thatcher, I think, was the Prime Minister of Britain at that time. They went to Washington and convinced Reagan to remove sanctions, because that was stupid thing to do, and don't worry about geopolitical loyalty, but economically it will. And he lifted sanctions. Can we imagine something like this today? Absolutely not. And that means that European sense of self-interest has disappeared. I don't see any sources from which it can reemerge. Even in the very unlikely case, because Europe is not America. In America, Trump can win. I'm almost sure that in Europe, even if similar forces will prevail, the masters of democratic manipulations will do something to remove them from real power. But even if they prevail, so okay, so what? Marine Le Pen becomes French president, and so what should she do with this landscape? I don't see a lot of options for her. That's why I don't expect any serious reshuffle of relationship between Russia and Europe, unlike US. With the US, it's more it's unlikely, but it's more possible than with the European Union.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, the word fairy tale, because I think it it does explain some of the reason why there's an absence of pragmatism, which you find in the United States, because it's worth pointing out that in Europe, over the past decades, this ideology that developed of Europe pursuing this perpetual peace that is the end of history. Europe has transcended its own past. It's a whole new chapter where where the laws of gravity no longer applies. Where you would have liberal peace based on the collective hegemony of the political West. It's we kind of, I think, bought fully into this and bet everything on it. And now that it's starting to fall apart, that is, the Americans are relative decline. They're going to Asia. A lot of the assumptions not playing out. It's there's no alternative, because if the Americans can do course correction, as Trump say, this is not our problem, give it to the Europeans. For Europe, there's no other. We made a whole ideology out of this policy, so there's nowhere to go really. And but it does beg the question how far this can go, because in a multipolar system like what we have now, states, rational states, in terms of maximizing their own prosperity and security, they have to actually respond to realities. And I feel you mentioned before the countries who have sanctioned Russia, they're the one who are security dependent on the United States, and this is the whole point. The security dependence can be converted into economic and political loyalties. But we also see that this is what makes Europe less and less prosperous and relevant now. That is, yesterday I think it was Alexander pointing out this. Europe now is buying buying Russian oil from India at a higher price, with deindustrializing for no purpose at all, just to hold on to this idea that we're not acting rational anymore. We're not pushing national interest, and it can only go so far. As we see the German economy falling apart, you see political instability from France, Italy, Germany. This can't really go on forever. At some point, one gets the impression that a bit like 1989, but this time in reverse, our political elites will be brushed aside because, I think that the absence of alternatives is really what is causing a lot of this radical behavior. Just this country, for example, is a case study in Norway. Through the whole Cold War, we tried to have a balance between deterring the Soviet Union and not provoking, so having no basis. Now that the Americans are leaving Europe, apparently, or getting weaker, the rational decision will be to diversify, make peace with your neighbor, connect with India, China, the rest of the world, not to have all your eggs in a basket when this is not a winning horse anymore. But instead, we're opening American bases left and right on our soil because we're hoping to increase our own market value so the Americans won't leave us. I mean, this is really desperate, irrational actions. So I'm just wondering, how long can this go on before things fall apart? And that will be my last question, by the way.
It's not up to me to predict anything about Europe, and Europeans should start to think about this in normal, realistic terms. Because what I can tell you about my own experience. I haven't visited Europe since quite a while now, but all the time I have extremely intense in change, starting from 2000s, when I started to work as editor of the journal and started to visit Europe on a regular basis, and until the end of previous decade. That was a very strange discussion all the time. I remember very well that's an episode from my personal experience. That was year 2009. I was invited to Berlin to speak for a very important group of people. Think tankers, business people, some politicians, and so on. 2009, I stress, that was the beginning of still very great, but feelings of something. And then Greek crisis came very soon, and then this chain of crisis. And the question which the audience posed to me was, what do you think about Russia 10 years from now? Can you predict? What can you expect? I said that, of course, it's very difficult to expect anything. We live in an extremely turbulent world, which will change a lot, and those changes, global changes, will have direct impact on changes inside any country. That's why Russia, and then of course, I numbered some pluses and minuses of our situation, trying to be more or less objective and balanced. And then I said that, of course, but unfortunately, we can discuss Russia, but we should discuss the European Union as well, because we don't know how European Union would like 10 years from now. Absolutely no idea, because everything will change. The reaction was they were laughing, all of them. They said, are you crazy? What are you talking about? Yes, Russia is unpredictable, totally. But here, we know exactly what will happen. Oh, okay, some nuances, but in general. Then I asked, okay, what will be here 10 years from now in the European Union? And they said, it will be like now, but better. Seriously. I said, okay, let's discuss 10 years from now. Unfortunately, 10 years after, I had no chance to meet them again. But I'm afraid that it was not because my audience was stupid. That was because the dogmatic framework, which we here in this country remember very well from the Soviet Union time, now it is there. And even today, when everything is crumbling and the world as prescribed in the directives of the European Commission is collapsing, but it's absolutely impossible for people in charge to get rid of that. And to some extent, I say a terrible thing now, to some extent, the war which is happening now, that's the only way to keep it going. As long as the war continues, you can, so to say, subscribe all bad things to Russia and not to think about yourself. But it will be over at some point. And then I think Europeans will ask questions, Americans will ask questions, and even the bosses in Europe will need to give some answers. And to give answers as they got used to give will be insufficient.
Mm-hmm. Any final thoughts, Alexander?
Well, I just to say, what Mr. Lukyanov just said, it reminds me of that expression. I think it was actually, certainly Thatcher, and it was, by the way, Thatcher who went to Reagan and said, you can't sanction us, and she was very, very outspoken about it. But anyway, just on this last point, she used to say very often, that which is unsustainable cannot be sustained. And she was right. It's absolutely true. I mean, you can disagree with her with many things. I certainly did. I opposed her on those things. But on that, she was absolutely spot on. She was completely correct about this. And I think in Europe, we're going to find that very, very quickly. And I agree, by the way, with what Glenn said. The very fact that the Americans appear to be in relative decline and are thinking about the rest of the world is making us go even further to try to keep them here, and in ways that are incredibly self-destructive and ultimately irrational. But this is the spasm that we're going through in Europe at this particular time, and it has to run its course, and eventually at some point I suspect it will. That's my last thoughts.
Yeah, I heard the same from the Europeans now. They're going to start buying expensive LNG from United States because that will make Trump more interested in Europe. It's just it's quite crazy. But just one last comment. I think also it's quite understandable where the Europeans come from, though, because if you look at the 1990s, everyone wants to join the EU. The EU simply has to, set conditions. Just have better democracy, better governance, and will allow you to join. I mean, the ability to present themselves as a force of good, and the alternative is some backward, power politics, which we have already transcended. That politics effectively became, let's socialize the rest of the world to become more like us, because we already broke the code. It's a nice way to look at at international affairs, but obviously, probably very delusional as well. So yes,
if I may, just I ask, I hate to. I listened to myself and understood that I sound a little bit like an American neoconservative who knows better how others should live and do. To be fair, I must say that with all criticism we can have about Europe looking from the outside, of course, Russia is facing enormous challenges and will face even bigger challenges after this conflict will end. Not just direct consequences of this war, which will be in place as well, but I think we arrived, as everybody, as America, as Europe, as China, we arrived to the moment when previous experience should be reconsidered profoundly. We lived for several decades, for 30 plus years, in the aftertaste of the Soviet Union. It might sound strange, it's so many years since collapse of the Soviet Union, but mentally it was still there. It's very, very long process of reevaluation. And sometimes, even today, we see some attempts to restore some elements of the Soviet approaches, which will fail completely. It will not work. But it shows that there's an intellectual vacuum is here. We try to understand how to position Russia in this new world, not only in terms of geopolitical issues or economy, but who we are. And the idea of Russian civilization, from my point of view, it's very timely, but it's absolutely insufficient. It's good to start the discussion. We don't know what the Russian civilization is. And I think that at the end, we need to create a completely new perception of ourselves, which is not in place yet. And to say very terrible thing, the generation of rulers, of leaders of Russia today, they, as President Putin as well, they are much more about to close the chapter of the end of the Soviet Union and to give floor to the new understanding, new people and new ideas. Hopefully it will happen rather sooner than later, because of course this war, I agree with President Trump, this war should stop. But it's not, again, it's not the turning point, it's the beginning of a turning point, and that's as troublesome for Russia as for anybody else.
Mr. Lukyanov, thank you very much. Can I just quickly say, as somebody who has to speak to neoconservatives, American neoconservatives, quite a lot, you have never at any point in this program sounded like one. Just to make that completely clear. Thank you very much from me.
Yeah, I wish I would have put time in for questions about how this war has changed national identity and confidence and all of this of Russia, but we seem to be out of time. So
that's for another program.
We can discuss it again. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again, Mr. Lukyanov.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.